My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. Chris Waldburger, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy. Good to be back.
Yeah, dude. So the last few guests on my UK column show, which is British, have been South African. So you are adding to the mix, although you're not in South Africa.
No, very much South African, but I'm still in Africa, but East Africa. So up here in Kenya, in very rural part of Kenya, actually, but we've got good internet and power's on. So glad to be with you.
I was just chatting to another guest, PD Lawton, and she was talking about a high-speed railway network that is underway around the African continent with some Chinese help. And I think Kenya actually already has elements of that infrastructure built.
Yeah, I've been on it a few times. There's what's it called? The Madaraki Express from Nairobi to Mombasa with stops on the way. And very impressive. It's super clean. Runs on time. It's not high speed, but it's faster than driving, but that's mostly because of the highways, but quite cheap. And then when you get to the Mombasa station, there's a big statue of a Chinese explorer who apparently reached East Africa 1,000 years ago or something like that. But yeah, that's really good. I think the latest thing, I think they might be helping with building a new highway, or to go to a double carriage highway from Nakuru up inland to some of the bigger towns inland. And hopefully that gets finished quickly, because the country really, really needs a proper highway in this kind of busy corridor. But yeah, elements of those train stations and the train itself, it wasn't that dissimilar from Switzerland, to be honest. It's just people are noisier in Africa. In Switzerland, everyone's quiet and you get stared at if your child makes a noise and all of that. But no, it's really good.
I love living in Africa, don't you?
Yeah, that's why I spent 1 year in Switzerland and then I came back. I must admit, every now and again, I do feel the pull towards first world comforts. Not that I'm not comfortable, but like litter on the streets and that kind of thing. But that probably is more to do with me than Africa. I'm part Swiss, and so hence the 1 year in Switzerland. My father's side comes from Switzerland, and I think I've got that Swiss obsession with cleanliness always ready to break out.
Yeah, I mean, I was accused after I went to China last year for almost a month. I came back saying a bunch of good things about the country, and how dare you say good things about that totalitarian hellhole? You must only trash that country. Yeah. But my point is that I wouldn't leave Africa. You have to live here to kind of understand it. It's difficult to explain to somebody who doesn't come from the continent.
Yeah, I think how I put it, and this got a little bit Jordan Peterson-esque, so forgive me, when I lived in Switzerland, was that it's like the yin and the yang of order and chaos. And you feel like there's some countries, particularly in the so-called first world, that are just too much order. And then you get Africa, which is largely too much chaos, but if you could position yourself well, you can balance it nicely. That you feel you don't feel this kind of bureaucracy breathing down your neck, and then if you can navigate a little bit away, take a bit of take the opportunities that chaos brings, then you can live a great life.
Yes, that's what I've been trying to say. Like there's a sense of freedom in the chaos on the African continent. Look, it's a very big continent, and when we talk about Africa, I mainly mean sub-Saharan.
Yeah. That's not even like north of Sahara. I don't think, do they even consider themselves African? I mean, I think they look really, even Ethiopians, I don't know if they consider themselves part of the continents. But yeah, I think there's some people who, depends on your circumstances in life, there's some people who can't, if you can't shield yourself enough from the chaos in Africa, then it could be a good option for you not to be here. So I think of South Africans, if you're just say you're in like Benoni and you're struggling to cover your expenses, and you don't have a good community spirit, you don't have, you're not shielded from like all the mayhem, then I would always tell somebody never go to Australia. Or Canada sounds even worse, but I can understand why people would be negative about Africa in that situation. But what I've found living in another African country besides South Africa is I think a lot of South Africans don't realize, first of all, how wealthy South Africa is. There's like so much wealth and luxury, how good the food is. There's nothing like it in the whole world. And then also, I don't think a lot of South Africans don't realize that that the rest of Africa doesn't have nearly the same levels of violence on average. So that's also another interesting thing about Africa, is that actually if you're not living in and it's true of South Africa too, if you're not living in the absolute worst parts, and if your country's not engaged in a low-grade civil war, it's a lot safer than many, many places in America, for example. Yeah.
As we're talking, I'm trying to find a smart segue into your book,
Nietzsche.
I think I found the segue. So Nietzsche was famous for God is dead, and I think it's fair to say that God is not dead in Africa.
Yeah, and I was actually, the book, The Word and the Flame, Reconciling Nietzsche with Christ, is I've just released it. I'm doing a quiet, slow and steady release. But I have written about, the sun just came out on me here. I have written about Nietzsche and his connection with Christianity a few times, and I've spoken about it a few times. I was actually with Ernst van Zyl, I think it was last year, and we discussed the issue of Nietzsche and Christianity, and how the relationship therein people think is quite simple. God is dead, I am the Antichrist. But anytime somebody's being that vociferous about being anti-something, there's usually something more complicated there. But one of the connections we found between Nietzsche and Africa, and I actually didn't think to keep the quote up, was there's a moment where Nietzsche says, he's talking about the issue of socialism in Europe and the threat socialism is bringing to Europe, and this is in 19th century. And he actually says, well, look, if we have too many unemployed people, far easier than engaging in any kind of social revolution is for people to leave, and not necessarily never to come back, but there's something outside of Europe. If you leave Europe, you can almost recover those old European values because you're at a distance from it, and you can awaken some of that old European spirit, those old virtues which have been lost upon layers of bureaucracy and statism, and so it's quite interesting because if speaking to Conscious Caracal, obviously very much fighting for his people, the Afrikaners, and if you compare the Afrikaners to the Dutch or to the French or to the Germans, their kind of ancestral forebears, you think about how much more like some of those, the old values of Christianity and family and all of that have stayed more alive in Africa than they have in the mother country, and people said the same thing about the Rhodesians in the 60s and 70s. They were more British than the British. So it is interesting how you can make that connection between Nietzschean will to power and the space that perhaps Africa provides, or places outside of the modern liberal empire, that gives you a little bit of space and freedom to breathe. And I think that's one Nietzsche famously said. I actually had it in front of me because I thought this would come up. He wrote he described the state in this way, and this, remember, is in the 19th century. This is not 20th century welfare state. This is not 20th century surveillance state. This is political correctness. Nobody's heard of it. There's no Bolsheviks yet. Europe is still, people would recognize it as Europe. There's no World War I. And he wrote this, and thus spoke Zarathustra. The state is the coldest of all cold monsters. It is a sin against law and customs. Its great lie is that the state is the people. And then he talks about there being a great conflict between destroyers, who are the bureaucrats of this modern state, and what they do is hang a sword and 100 cravings upon the people, versus the creators, as opposed to the destroyers, who create peoples and hang faith and love over them. And he kind of foreshadows both George Orwell there. There's a sword over the people, and Aldous Huxley. You threaten the people with 100 cravings of consumerism and pornography and all that to kind of deaden them, versus people who are actually connected with their own kin, with their own people. Who and this is where it's interesting. He says that those creators have faith and love as the emblems of their community. And again, right there, you see, and we'll probably get there later. You see something about Nietzsche being more complex when it comes to his relationship with Christianity than I think many people realize.
Okay, so your book is effectively arguing that Nietzsche spent his life trying to overcome nihilism while ultimately fighting the cause for Christianity.
Yeah, that's a very, yeah, I suppose you could say that. I wouldn't put it quite like that. So my argument is that it is possible to reconcile Nietzsche with Christ. And a close reading of Nietzsche demonstrates that his antagonism towards Christianity is far more complex than people think. So start with God is Dead. Okay, there's a biographer of Nietzsche's, or a philosopher, Henry de Lubac, famous Catholic philosopher, who points out that Nietzsche probably got that phrase from a Lutheran hymn that would have been sung at his local church. His father was a Lutheran minister. God is dead. Jesus is God. Jesus dies on the cross. God is dead is actually Christian doctrine. So even there's a little bit of complexity. And of course, that's not quite what he's saying. I understand that, but that just shows you there's a little bit of complexity there. When people often talk about how Nietzsche is presented as an amoral philosopher. He says might is right, and you can see elements of that, certainly. I'm not saying that that's a completely wrong reading of Nietzsche, but it's not that simple about what is beyond good and evil. He wrote a famous book called called Beyond Good and Evil, which is often considered his most important book. Where it serves as almost like a commentary upon his more poetic work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But what is beyond good and evil? Actually, the book says what is beyond good and evil. It's love. So I don't think people realize, I was reading it and thinking to myself, this doesn't sound like this a maniac person in jackboots who suggests we just like trample the weak and hurdle the dead as we go along. He actually said, and we've already looked at faith and love, or what people who creators, or those who imbue those around them with faith and love. And if you think about good and evil, the other thing which I would point out is similarly to God is dead. The first kind of instance in ancient literature of where we see good and evil is in Genesis, where it says that's where the forbidden fruit was on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There was something negative about good and evil suggested there. And what was the other tree which they lost the right to? It was the tree of life. And I think that sums up a lot of what Nietzsche was trying to say. He was trying to say that so much of our morality doesn't give life to us. And that's nihilism for him. God is dead. There's no ultimate meaning anymore. But a few of us who are strong enough to see into this, we can overcome that by living, by transcending almost and becoming Übermensch, by becoming Overman or Superman, and that gets kind of simplified as well. But the idea being is that you create value and you live, you become who you are. Now, he did believe that modern nihilism was complicit with Christianity. He believed that Christianity was Platonism for the people, is what he called it. So it was really just a riff on ancient Greek philosophers who he wasn't a big fan of. He liked the pre-Socratics, he loved Homer, he loved Hellenism, but he didn't
He hated Plato.
Yeah, Socrates and Plato, these are not good dudes because they posit that there's an ideal world beyond. And so he says they negate this world. Which interestingly, Aristotle, I think, corrects. And I think maybe also we make what is in Platonism is not necessarily always what's in Plato. I think it's more complicated in Plato than those who systematized after him made it out to be. And then Christianity extends that. He has a big argument against, the concept of sexual purity, or the concept of heaven, or the concept of self-sacrifice, or dying to yourself. The whole cross is anathema to him. But my position in the book is that when you actually read Nietzsche closely, first of all, he is not so simplistically against mercy and love and charity. As I've already pointed out, he makes a comment that he respects people who have mercy and love their neighbors if they have claws. Meaning if you're not doing it out of a position of weakness, if you're not doing it out of a position of self-righteousness, but there's a genuine, from a position of strength, you're doing it. And I think I think there's a lot of overlap there with a genuine reading of Christianity and a classical reading of Christianity. And so my big thesis, to put it more poetically, is that the God that Nietzsche is destroying or fighting against, or is just proclaiming his death. He doesn't believe God is real. He's just saying now the truth of that's going to catch up with us, and we're entering this great risky time of nihilism. What I think he's actually doing, without knowing it, except maybe at the end, when something, his breakdown is really strange at the end of his life, what I think he's doing is he is actually he's opening up a space for us to bury not God, but an abstraction of the Christian God, an idol of the Christian God that we had built to put between us, as in the European world, and God, so that we can control our own little bureaucratic little lives and live nice, conventional, happy lives. And he's actually allowing us to look at that and say, well, maybe that isn't God. And maybe that God, in inverted commas, should die. And he says at one point, only where there are tombs are there resurrections. Again, a very interesting thing for a guy who proclaims himself to be the Antichrist to say. And I think maybe we can understand Nietzsche's work as a tomb.
But he also spoke about slave morality, and that's what he paralleled Christianity with.
Yeah. So the basic idea there is you have slaves and masters. You can understand aristocrats and peasants, or however you want to put it. And the master has succeeded. The master has strength. The master has wealth. The master is good looking. The master is able to overcome kind of the bonds of menial labor and all of that. So what is the slave's response? And he made this kind of most clear in the book, The Genealogy of Morals, which he says morality is constructed out of the resentment of the slave. Now, the slave can't defeat the master, so he has to think of not directly, so he thinks of an indirect way to defeat the master. So he makes himself into a kind of priest, and he says, you know what? What the master is bad. It's people like us, the downtrodden, we're going to inherit the kingdom of God. The rich, the powerful, you are not the chosen. You are not saved. And slowly, the priesthood of the slave gains power over time as kind of religion seeps into society, and then eventually this slave morality comes to be seen as true metaphysical reality. That is how morals work, but in actual fact, all along it's been the ploy of the slaves to gain power. Now you can see why there's a massive criticism against Christianity built in there, because you worship a crucified Jesus. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, turn the other cheek, love your neighbor, love your enemy, lay down your life for others." And you can see why. You can see that for Nietzsche would be slave morality. But I think what he misses is that's not where Christianity stops. It's not the point of the cross. The cross doesn't make any sense without the resurrection in Christianity. So, and there's many passages in the New Testament where it speaks about how it was for the sake of the glory that would come, or for the joy that was set before him, that Jesus carried his cross, that Jesus went to the grave. It was because he saw what came out of that. And we see Nietzsche, and if you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he has similar ideas where he talks about the way to the ultimate metamorphosis, that a person who wants to go along the path of the overman or the Übermensch should undergo is you need to become the camel, carry a burden. And then that means you can become the lion because you've overcome the burden. And then eventually you can become the child because you're free to live in joy. And that mirrors quite closely actually what the Christian journey is meant to be. You go through the desert, yes, but it's to get to the promised land. So I think he misses a whole aspect of the classical Christian faith and the importance of resurrection and the fact that power is not suspect when it's within God himself. That the apostles are told by Jesus they're going to sit on the thrones of Israel. That New Testament believers are told by Paul that the universe belongs to them and they will judge the angels even. So sometimes I wonder if some of these guys didn't actually spend enough. You assume you know what the Bible says, but then when you go and read it, actually, I hadn't read that part before. Nobody's told me about that part before. So where I think the value of Nietzsche for Christians comes in is that there are, in terms of modern Christendom and where we're at, and especially in Nietzsche's time, there's a lot of slave morality within the Christian world, within the church. A lot of, I will just die and let my culture perish. And you know what? It doesn't even matter if the church dies. I'm going to just let myself and my identity and my faith be trampled upon, because that's the loving thing to do, because we are egalitarians now, and we're not going to worry about great Christian saints anymore. We're going to worship Martin Luther King and George Floyd, for example. And he's right, when insofar as Christians do live like that and embrace what I think is a false reading of the New Testament and embrace kind of the slave morality identified, he's a useful antidote. And the parallel there is how Thomas Aquinas looked at Aristotle to correct some of the erroneous tendencies in the medieval church, which was to disdain the body, to disdain the material world because it's not the ideal world. And Aristotle, in response to Plato, said, no, the forms are not in some other like third place. The forms are in the things themselves. Meaning is in us. Our soul, the soul is the form of the body. The soul belongs with the body. And just as Thomas Aquinas looked at Aristotle and said, you know what he said as a Greek pagan is true and makes sense for us. And I think that Nietzsche almost can be seen as, if Aristotle was like a pre-Christian thinker, I think of Nietzsche as being a useful post-Christian thinker, because he sees this issue of slave morality clearly.
Interestingly, you mentioned Martin Luther King. Now, Martin Luther is somebody for whom he had no time. I mean, he thought that the Reformation was a complete disaster, and it fragmented the grandeur and the aristocratic hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which I believe he did admire to some degree.
No, he did respect Martin Luther to some extent. He did kind of see him as some kind of like a Germanic genius. He was very opposed to monasticism. So he was very, so that would have made him unsympathetic to the Catholic Church. The Pope features as a character in one of his books, and he's kind of lampooned. What he did say was that Jesus was the last Christian. And he promulgated an idea which didn't begin with him, was that St. Paul invented Christianity and Jesus was something different. And that's like been a common idea throughout history. People still say today that Jesus didn't come to establish a church or a religion, and Paul systematized it. Which is, again, it's modern theologians looking for something original to say who've built that like strange edifice that there's this massive contradiction between Jesus and Paul. So yeah, he is interesting on the question of Jesus. Something I say in the book is he says his ideal man would be Caesar with the soul of Christ. And I point out, well, that actually is Christ. That's exactly Jesus. Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, but he's humble, and he has, he has the purity of God himself, because he is God himself. So he is Caesar with the soul of Christ. He is the emperor, the imperator. And maybe it's because Christians stopped thinking of God and the Trinity in hierarchical ways that Nietzsche didn't quite see that. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I think we should reconcile Nietzsche with Christ, is because he reminds us that there is hierarchy in life. That if a Christian looks at the doctrine of Imago Dei, God is made in man's image, and says therefore that everybody's completely equal, therefore everybody must be treated exactly the same, they're wrong, they're heretics. And Nietzsche is right to say, no, actually there is hierarchy. Obviously there has to be, because there's some who are baptized and there's some who are not. There's some who set apart for different ministries. There's some who set apart to be kings and princes and so forth. And the Bible endorses all of those things. So I think there is a great deal of complexity there.
That statement of his "God is dead" obviously wasn't a celebration, it was a diagnosis. He was commenting on where society was at and where it was going. And here's something interesting. When I was in Amsterdam just a few years ago, we were traveling around with a Christian friend, and she was showing us all the empty churches. I mean, they were just empty. They were just museums and places you couldn't go and have a look at, from antiquity. And I asked her, what happened to Christianity? And her response to me was, we killed God.
And he also predicted what the ramifications would be of this nihilism. And so did Dostoevsky, who I also write about a great deal in the book, to show that traditionally we think of them as being people who faced the same issue of modern nihilism and came to different conclusions. And I show that actually, I think they came to conclusions which are more similar, but using slightly, and not even always, different language. So that comes from, there's a passage in The Madman where the passage is called The Madman, where from the Joyful Science, where a madman arrives at a public square and he says, God is dead, and everybody ignores him, saying, what are you talking about? And he says, I've come too early. But God is dead and we have killed him. His point was exactly right. It wasn't a celebration. It was a diagnosis that, it was more a revelation that actually nobody believes in God anymore. We say we do, but it's just convention. And give it a few years, give it a little bit of time, and we're all going to realize we don't believe in God. And then the question is going to be, what do we believe in? And Nietzsche said, well, this will probably result in a lot of violence, but it's also going to result in what he calls the last man. And the last man is the person who wants to be part of the herd, the person who wants to wear the mask and get the vaccine, the person who wants to remain comfortable. And if anyone threatens that comfort, then that person needs to be got rid of and needs to be excommunicated. But in the midst of that, there was the possibility of a new path opening up. People who could look into the abyss, but not let the abyss look into them. Who could wrestle the monster and not be killed by the monster. Do not, in slaying the monster, you do not let the monster slay you.
It's interesting what you're saying. I mean, I know a lot of Christians throughout my life who have had this eternal battle with meaning and purpose, despite being Christians. And I can see the immediate parallel with Nietzsche. He also was having this sort of existential, tug of war.
Yeah, at one point, it's one of the woman who rejected his proposals, I think more than once, Lou Salome, who becomes one of, if I'm correct, one of Freud's first patients. I mean, it's bizarre. Couldn't really think of more.
What a horrible man.
Yeah, disgusting. But she said that Nietzsche just was obsessed with God, that he spoke about God continuously.
So in other words, he spoke more about God than an average Christian.
Probably. Yeah. That is, and especially at that time, where he was very critical of the German Reich, which was the Second Reich, which started under Bismarck and Wilhelm I, and he was very critical of its conventionalism, of its what he called like an anti-culture of it. It was bourgeois. It was like capitalist in the worst sense, and he wasn't proud of actually being a German, really, which is contrary to what people think. But yeah, he like so many people today, the ones who what marks somebody as different and as radical is willing to open their eyes and see, well, what's at stake in our age. And like I said, Dostoevsky did the same. One of the characters in the Brothers Karamazov says, if there's no God, then there's no good or evil, then we can do as we wish. And we've got to deal with that question. And not just say, no, we'll just be good Englishmen or good Germans. Søren Kierkegaard is doing the same thing in his own Protestant, interestingly, Lutheran society in Denmark, saying this is not, Christian faith has to be like something really transcendent and terrifying, rather than something comfortable and just like good manners. And so I think Nietzsche, by asking these questions, and through his diagnosis of what society actually was, is a really helpful thinker, because he forces you back to the ultimate.
What you're talking about, though, is something that I think humans have always thought about. And I don't think necessarily Nietzsche was unique. We are always thinking about why we wake up in the morning.
I think that's true, but I think there are certain periods in history where people can kind of just join in the machinery of society and can become the last men. You just seek comfort. You just wake up and you go to your crap job and your wife shouts at you on the way out or something, and then you pick up your kids and you're in debt and you watch Netflix. So I guess your placeholder there, like you said, is just consumerism. It's just comfort. And he was pointing out that he was pointing that out in the 19th century. Can you imagine what he would think today? I often say the same thing about Heidegger, who, comes after Nietzsche, and he's complaining about this perverse relationship we have with technology in the early 20th century. And imagine what he would think now. So, even Aldous Huxley, I think, would be shocked by how we've managed to achieve or amuse ourselves to death. Or, what he talks about, Nietzsche says about the people are seduced with 100 cravings that they don't need. There's no willingness to actually experience pain, to actually experience a sense of crisis. So I think what makes Nietzsche important is that at a certain time in history, he sees this happening in a concentrated form, that this is a unique moment in the history of particularly Europe. He always called himself, I'm a good European. And for him, he believed that actually we could capture something which we'd lost from the ancient Greeks, capture their love for life and strength and glory. And that was kind of his ideal. Whereas when I look at Nietzsche and I look at it closely, and I think to myself, and especially when I overlay him with Dostoevsky in the book, I look at novels from Dostoevsky compared with the figure of Zarathustra, which is Nietzsche's kind of alter ego that he writes about. And I think that what the solution to modern nihilism was, and what he alludes to without having maybe the language to get at it, is that the will to power, his famous doctrine that everything is the will to power. All life is a function of the will to power, and your will to power can grow sick and unhealthy and resentful. Or you can let it. It can become healthy, and it can draw in multiple drives and rise up in complexity, and chaos can give birth to a dancing star, as he puts it. I think that all of that is actually precisely what the Christian revelation was centuries before. Was that the world is. There is a principle, there is a core, there is a fire at the heart of this world, which is now available to us to live in and to escape kind of the sickness that we're prone to, whether it be slave morality or bovine identity. And so the book's title is The Word and the Flame. And the word is a reference to the Logos, which in John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, or in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and the Logos takes on flesh and dwells among us, and that's Christ is the Word of God. And for Nietzsche, and for many kind of modern right, pagan, neo-Nietzschean dissidents, who you kind of see on the dissident spaces, especially on X, if you think of a guy like Bronze Age Pervert being kind of the archetype of that. They're very skeptical of any, they call them word cells instead of incels, people who want to put labels on things, or you want to be philosophers and categorize things, and that gets associated with Christianity, because Christianity is the Word. You have the Bible. Jesus is described as the Word of God, and what I wanted to show was that actually the Word and the flame are one. That the fire, that the intensity, that the power we want to experience in life, that we feel is at the core of life, that is the Word. That the Word is the living vitality that brings everything into being and keeps everything into being. And so ultimately, the will to power is the will to Christ. Now there's a long route that I take to get there. So that's why I encourage people to read the book. I can just hint at it here. It's it's a bit of a philosophical treatise, but I think it does. I hope it rewards the reader.
And of course, the undercurrent, based on what you were just saying now, is that Nietzsche was right to attack the weak, feeble, herd-like, pity-soaked Christianity that we can see around us, and not even just in Christianity, but it's the postmodern, feminized version of society where men are no longer men and power is seen as a bad thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like liquid modernity where everything must be conformed into like a sludge.
Egalitarianism.
Egalitarianism. There's no hierarchy, and that's the reason why we see so much like terrible modern art and music, is because beauty is essentially hierarchical. And so Nietzsche was a great lover of music for that.
And men who want to be women, or just men who are just heavily feminized.
Yeah. Like eat the soy and vote for Keir Starmer and I think what woke a lot of people up to this was 2020, and I think that's why and I do point to that in the introduction to the book as 2020, but before. You kind of see a lot of Nietzschean themes all of a sudden. You can even argue that Trump being elected, now I'm just talking about Trump as a symbol here, not as an actual person, because you could spend hours criticizing the actual person, but as a symbol, what Trump was kind of a rejection of neoconservatism, of like good Christian man like George Bush. He's busy bombing Christians in Iraq and Syria and all of that. And it was like a rise of a tougher, more secular, I say right, but it's not really right wing, it's 90s liberalism. So there was like there was Brexit and all of these things are best understood as symbols because they actually weren't the things maybe we thought they were or we hoped they would be, but they did represent something in the zeitgeist, I think. And so there was this like turn against the political correctness, like that was so kind of embodied by like a figure like Barack Obama, and even like a George Bush and so you got Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Tony Blair, that whole world of like, I suppose best way of saying it is, you could call it neoliberalism, you can call it neoconservatism, it's like Trotskyism almost, you could call it. And a lot of these guys have a fascination with Trotsky, which is interesting. And all of a sudden people realized, actually, I don't care if people call me racist. I don't care if Trump says the most outrageous things. I'm done with that anymore. And so there was this kind of like undercurrent of, actually, I want to defend my home. I don't care if people mock me for owning a gun. I don't care if I say the word gay in a bad way. I'm done with that. And then of course you got 2020, which then just pushed it even further, where you had like the utter insanity of what we could call the therapeutic state, the nanny state. It's called nanny for a reason, not gardener or anything. It's a feminine figure. It's a matriarchy coming to its zenith in masks and social distancing and look after granny. And then right in the middle of that, you got George Floyd. There's this moment in Beyond Good and Evil, I've actually got it in front of me, so I'll read it, where I just thought to myself, Nietzsche saw George Floyd. And he wrote this in Beyond Good and Evil 201. We have been led to a point in the history of society when it becomes so pathologically soft and tender that, among other things, it sides even with those who harm it, criminals, and does this quite seriously and honestly. And so we've seen that play out in gender politics, immigration, in secularism, in policing. Not that I'm a big fan of the police, and I'm kind of like want police on my door and patrolling the streets, but kind of in worshipping George Floyd. I think that told us a lot about, you tell a society about what it worships, and George Floyd was the savior. We've known for a while Hitler is Satan, Martin Luther King and Mandela maybe compete for Jesus, but then George Floyd, like, it just went to the maximal degree where actually now we find a guy who was like a porn star, a bouncer, was on drugs, was like in and out of jail. He is God. and so you can see why Nietzsche became popular then, and that's one reason why I started writing about Nietzsche. And actually, the book comes out of a doctoral dissertation. Was I thought to myself, there's so much that's right about Nietzsche, and there's so much that connects with me and friends of mine who oppose this kind of modern therapeuticism and statism, but we're Christians, and so what's the issue here between why do we feel so much kinship with this philosopher and some of his ideas, and when we read it, we're like, spot on, that's it. And so that was me actually, well, let me go and read Nietzsche closely, and let me go and read the New Testament again closely. Let me read some of the church fathers again closely, and let's cut away some of the stuff that was happening around the Enlightenment and around Nietzsche's time. And then let's look at Nietzsche with Dostoevsky, who's kind of dealing with the exact same issues, and let's see what comes out. And what came out was, we can reconcile Nietzsche with Christ.
At the risk of derailing an otherwise brilliant conversation, you said, I thought to myself, and I've often wondered, why do we say that? I mean, who else can you think to? I thought to my wife.
Some of us have interior monologue, okay? So because we're high IQ, and some of us don't. So we're in a conversation with ourselves.
It's like that adage about a frog in a boiling pot. I mean, I wonder if anybody's actually ever boiled a frog to see what would happen.
Yeah, that might not even be true.
I don't know anyone who boiled a frog.
Yeah, who discovered that?
So, I mean, the moral of the story here is that there's no need to be or to take offense at Nietzsche's work if you are a Christian. You can actually find many overlaps.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the big advantages is Nietzsche cuts through this kind of, this dead conventional Christianity. You think of like modern politicians who, talk about Christian values or Christian ethos, and it's all just bullshit. It's like, it's just a parade of virtues that borrowed from Christianity and kind of like wrapped it around their own vacuity. And Nietzsche helps to cut through that. And if you think about when Christianity arrives and when it spreads like wildfire, it's over the pagan world, which had similar values to Nietzsche, values that were dying in the kind of like a Roman Empire, which was also effeminate and soft and diverse at that stage with not, they didn't print money, but they had fake money, easy debt, just like we do today. And it's quite interesting that Christianity caught so quickly on those people, because it works best on people who have a healthy view of humanity. So people who recognize strength is good. It's good to the good things in this life are good. That sex is good. That a powerful ruler ruling wisely and justly is good. Beautiful art is good. And then Christianity says yes, and these point to God. And so when a person is baptized, the person doesn't disappear, but the person is grace perfects nature. And that's something Thomas Aquinas famously said. Grace presupposes nature. And so I think one of the things that many people look to Nietzsche is to go back to a positive view of nature, that actually the heroes of the pagan past, the classical man, you can call him, that is a good thing, but it's incomplete. C.S. Lewis, funnily enough, he said something similar. He said, First we make the younger generation pagans, and then we can make them Christian. Speaking as a Christian apologist. And I said, well, that's what Nietzsche is doing. He's saying, let's clear away all of this. But then one of the points I make, and this kind of maybe gives some context into why I keep bringing up Dostoevsky, is there's the famous story that most people know about Nietzsche, besides the philosophy, besides the writings, is his breakdown. So before, I think
when
it's
he was
5 years.
at the end of his life, when he was looked after by other people.
Yeah, so he's looked after by his mother, then his sister. A friend of his is called to the city of Turin to come and take charge of him. He's writing these crazy letters in which he describes himself as the crucified, interestingly. And he's had this breakdown. He lives for another 5 years, if I'm correct, in these conditions of being nothing that looks like an Übermensch. And but the breakdown is very interesting. It happens in the city of Turin, and he sees a horse being flogged on the streets of Turin, and he runs to the horse and embraces it, and then falls down on the street and is carried into an inn. It's a little bit apocryphal. We're not sure how true it is, but it's the story. It's part of the mythos of Nietzsche. It's like a very important part of the mythos of Nietzsche. Now, a lot of people don't point this out. I'm sure I've probably just missed it, but that breakdown is following a script. And the script comes from Dostoevsky. In Crime and Punishment, the main character, Raskolnikov, and he's the character who decides, I'm going to murder this usurious moneylender, and I'm going to use the money, and I'm going to use this crime as a stepping stone to becoming a person beyond normal morality, like Napoleon. That sometimes achievement is more important than petty morality. So I'm going to murder this lady. And eventually he does, and he has a breakdown, and he ends up confessing because he can't shoulder the burden of this anymore. But before he does that, before he takes the final step in murdering this old woman, he has a dream when he's a young boy, and he sees a horse being flogged, and he tries to stop it and embrace it, and the peasants who are flogging and whipping this horse kind of push him off, and his father takes him away. And Nietzsche said of Dostoevsky, he's the only psychologist from whom I have learned anything. He described him as a psychologist, not in the kind of the modern sense of the word. But my deepest instincts go against him. So there's something ambivalent between him and Dostoevsky. And then his working life, his public life, not that he was a public person, but he was becoming it at the end. He breaks down in such a similar situation as something that came out of Dostoevsky. And I said, what if he realizes, and I'm sure some hard Nietzscheans are going to hate me for this, but what if he realizes that true power finds its completion in compassion, in suffering? What if the will to power is the Logos, and the Logos is the creator who comes down and descends to suffer? And Nietzsche was also a great fan, like I am, of the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher called Heraclitus. And Heraclitus said the way up and the way down is the same. And what if you have to go down to go up? And what if you need a tomb to have a resurrection? As Nietzsche himself said. So then I go into Dostoevsky and I wonder, could we find the Übermensch in Dostoevsky? And I go through the different characters like Raskolnikov, and I try to show that actually they were on the same mission, and they complete the same mission. They don't affect a massive change in the world, but a seed is planted, and those are seeds which we can use today.
The man who declared God is dead couldn't stop talking about God.
Yeah, and if we wanted to do some analysis of Nietzsche, what we remember is his father's a Lutheran pastor, and his father died when he was young. And so like so many intellectuals, he's kind of raised by his mother. He's got an older sister. So you wonder how much, are we dealing with like a Hamlet-like figure here? He's wrestling with the ghost of his father. Carl Jung is also, his father was also in Switzerland. It wasn't Lutheran; it was a Reformed pastor, and also had a difficult relationship with. His father didn't die, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I can remember. But it is interesting, these kind of relationships with fathers that must have had some some impact on that. To be sure, he's not always talking about God directly or addressing Christianity directly. He's criticizing the modern state a great deal. He's criticizing the Enlightenment a great deal. He calls a person like Immanuel Kant a catastrophic spider, and he goes into all of that. He criticizes Plato and Socrates a great deal, but he very much does see Christianity as kind of complicit, as the thing which needs to be overcome. At one point, I think he says we need to just go to Jerusalem and destroy it and just put snakes on it and salt it and just put snakes on it, because we won't be free until we're rid of that. We won't be truly European until we're rid of that. But then why? And sorry, I'm rambling on a bit here, but he says at one point it's good that we've had Plato and the Jews and Christianity, because they've made life more interesting and they've created they've brought a creative tension. So even directly, he kind of recognizes the value of Christianity as a challenge, but he does believe, or he does state, it's a challenge that has to be overcome. But what I argue is that overcoming the challenge just leads you to an older, more genuine form of Christianity.
Okay, so your book, The Word and the Flame, Reconciling Nietzsche with Christ. How can I get your book?
So, Amazon. If you read on Kindle, you can get it with one click and it delivers to your Kindle, as I'm sure Kindle readers all know. You can get a paperback on Amazon too. I'm not sure if this is still true in South Africa, because you now got amazon.co.za, but for South Africans, I think it can be tricky to get the paperback from Amazon. So you can go into Takealot, and you can order the paperback via Takealot too. So I'm on Substack. I've left social media for better or for worse, but I think it just gives me a little bit more focus at this stage, and kind of I'm based on Substack, and what I realized is Substack is dead on X. Like Elon hates Substack for some reason. He kind of believes everyone's going to start writing on X, but it's not happening. So I haven't bothered with that. So yeah, chriswaldburger.substack.com is where you can find my work. And paid subscribers get a free copy of the book.
Chris Waldburger, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thanks so much for having me.